She led her party, the National League for Democracy, or NLD, to a landslide victory in the 2015 general election. Aung San Suu Kyi is an iconic figure who dedicated her life to bringing democracy, freedom, and human rights to the country after 5 decades of military rule.
Aung San Suu Kyi is kind of like the savior for democracy and human rights.
In 2015, we were so overjoyed with the result, the landslide victory of the NLD.
But her 5-year leadership was marred by the ill treatment of the Rohingya Muslim minority amid a bloody crackdown by the country's military.
She's really owned this issue, stood out in front of it, and endorsed essentially, whether tacitly or sometimes explicitly, by saying she didn't think the military did anything wrong.
ခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာကျမတို့တွေအနေနဲ့ရိုဟင်ဂျာဆိုတဲ့ဥစ္စာကိုလက်မခံဘူးရိုဟင်ဂျာဆိုတာလည်းမရှိဘူးရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာရှိတာဗာလဲဆိုတော့ခိုးဝင်ဘင်္ဂါလီပဲ
Has her reputation as a global hero and moral icon been sullied by her inaction against the alleged violence against the Rohingya community in Myanmar? Can Aung San Suu Kyi lead her party to another landslide victory in next month's general election? Or will the military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, be able to seize the moment and make a strong comeback? On November 8, 2020, Myanmar will hold its second democratic election since the 1962 military coup. The military takeover marked the beginning of 50 years of totalitarian rule by the country's powerful army before its transition to a hybrid form of democratic rule just 5 years ago. But just as election fever has the country in its grip, it now has to come to terms with an ever-present threat. Myanmar's daily count of confirmed COVID-19 cases is rising rapidly, with case numbers doubling every week in the lead-up to the election. Opposition parties, including the military-affiliated Union Solidarity and Development Party, USDP, are calling for the polls to be postponed.
အားလုံးကအကန့်အသတ်နဲ့နေထိုင်သွားလာလောက်ကင်ဆောင်ရွက်နေရတယ်အဆက်ဆက်ရရတိုးတော့ညာလည်းပဲသူတို့ဒီအစိုးရဖြစ်နေတဲ့အတွက်ဒါဒီသူတို့အတွက်အားသာချက်ဖြစ်နေတယ်ပြည်ခိုင်ပြိုးပါတီအပါဝင်အခြားသောနိုင်ငံရေးပါတီတွေအတွက်ကတော့ဒါကြီးမားတဲ့စိန်ခေါ်မှုတစ်ရက်ဖြစ်နေတာပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့အဲ့လိုအကန့်အသတ်တွေဂျားတွေကဆောင်ရွက်နေရတာတို့အတွက်ကတော့တော်တော်လေးကိုဟိုများပါတယ်လို့စိန်ခေါ်မှုတွေများပါတယ်လို့ပြောချင်ပါတယ်
But the ruling National League for Democracy, NLD, is determined to press ahead with the election as scheduled. NLD spokesman Dr. Munyok says that the constitution does not provide for a mechanism to postpone the election beyond the current term. He also feels that this election is crucial for NLD to implement a lot of the reforms that were promised back in 2015.
မြို့သားပြည်တွေဆိုချင်တယ်9နှစ်ကြာနိုင်ငံတော်ဖတ်ဆောင်ရပါပြီဒီဖတ်ဆောင်ရဲ့လုပ်ရက်တွေကပြည့်စုံနေရှိတဲ့အတွက်ဒီလုပ်ခဲ့တဲ့လုပ်ရက်တွေကိုချီခိုင်အောင်ဒီ9နှစ်ကကျွန်တော်တို့အတွက်အရေးကြီးပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်ရဲ့ကြိုင်သက်ပါတီအနေနဲ့ကြာကျွန်တော်တို့9နှစ်မှဒီ10နှစ်အထိကျွန်တော်တို့အာဏာကိုလုပ်ကိုင်သုံးဆွဲလာနိုင်တယ်ဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်ရဲ့ဒီဆိုပါတီပေါ်မှာဒီရဲ့လုပ်တာ
Having survived the first few months of the pandemic almost unscathed, COVID-19 infections began to spike at the beginning of September, right before the campaigning period. As of October 17, 2020, Myanmar's health authorities had reported more than 30,000 cases and 800 deaths from the virus. On September 21st, Yangon, the country's largest city, went into lockdown. Physical rallies and campaigning are banned. "48-year-old Kyi says it's important for him to exercise the right to vote in this election. The taxi driver who lives with his elder brother is aware of the risks with the rise in COVID-19 cases. But according to him, the election is just a one-day affair, and polling can still continue if all the necessary safeguard measures are put in place.
Maybe as on one day, maybe as well. The Bama lodging hope on theatre baby. Maybe people do this or go check the party, no? General, I check the party, I party with general, Piamiro, no money the down, typical down usage in it. And you don't block maybe, no? And any party you talking, no? General, don't be while a yogi. Sorry. You can pick us up from maybe the changing as I don't know who's on a party where maybe Janet party will take Canada me out. September, Loma, holding same with us, no?
The significance of this election is, so we already have experienced the civilian power and the dynamic between the civilian and the military power in the parliament, also in the politics, also for the peace processes. So I think for 2020 is a time for us, for the civilian side, to make sure that we have a clear and strong strategy to make sure we will lead the democratic ground for the country for a future.
More than 1,100 seats will be up for grabs in Pidu Lutdo, the lower house, and Amuda Lutdo, the upper house, and across state and regional parliaments. 1/4 of the national seats in both the upper and lower houses are filled by unelected army representatives, as enshrined in the 2008 Constitution. The bloc of MPs selected by the country's commander-in-chief also has an effective veto power over any legislation. In 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi won Myanmar's landmark election. Her party, NLD, won a staggering 75% of seats in parliament. The victory also ended half a century of military dominance in politics. As the constitution bars anyone with foreign spouses or children from becoming president, Ms. Suu Kyi was then made the de facto leader of the country, assuming the newly created post of State Councillor. It's indeed a euphoric moment for the people of Myanmar, who long fought for their democratic rights as well as an end to decades of military rule. Among them was Thinzar Shunle Yi, who was 23 years old at the time. She says she was overjoyed to see that change was finally coming to Myanmar.
In 2015, after the election result being out, then everybody, including civil society member like me, we were so overjoyed with the result, the landslide victory of the NLD. The reason is because there will be the first ever civilian government from our popular vote. So that's a kind of a revolution that we go out and we went out and vote, and we vote out militarized government.
I think it was the euphoria then really is again the anticipation build-up and the feeling shared by many that the NLD's, the National League for Democracy's time had come. And so very similar to 1990, there was anticipation that this time around change has to happen.
But 5 years on, Aung San Suu Kyi's star image has begun to fade amid sluggish economic reforms. She's also become increasingly besieged by the harsh criticism over her handling of the Rohingya crisis. Has she been able to live up to her international reputation as an icon of morality and a beacon of universal human rights? Will her prospect of re-election remain bright as it was 5 years ago when she first swept to power? Democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi was once hailed both in Myanmar and around the world as a moral icon, a champion of peace and human rights. She even won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 for her non-violent struggle for democracy in defiance of the military government which ruled Myanmar with an iron fist for decades. Her resounding victory in the 2015 general election, therefore, was regarded as a sea change moment for many people in Myanmar.
I think the expectations, of course, it's because the time for the National League for Democracy had been so long in coming. And because Aung San Suu Kyi, at the head of the opposition, as well as the face of resistance during the days of the military junta, the kind of, I guess, iconic status, if you will, that she had, that her presence had in the country, across the globe. The expectations were quite high that, you know, now that she and her party were in the seat of power, they would be able to right all wrong.
But the euphoria surrounding her ascent to power was short-lived. Aung San Suu Kyi's first major test came in 2017. Hundreds of thousands of an ethnic Muslim minority fled their homes in Myanmar's Rakhine state and crossed into Bangladesh following a brutal military crackdown. It was the largest human exodus in Asia since the Vietnam War. A report published by United Nations investigators in August 2018 accused the Myanmar military of carrying out mass killings with genocidal intent, a charge denied by the military. For decades, successive governments in Myanmar viewed the Rohingya community, locally known as Bengalis, as illegal immigrants. The minority community has been systematically discriminated against and are deprived of their basic human rights. As non-citizens, they have no right to education, jobs, healthcare, basic services, and freedom of movement. That sentiment against the Rohingyas is also shared by Za Chi-lin, a member of the military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP.
ခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာကျမတို့တွေအနေနဲ့ Rohingya ဆိုတဲ့ဥစ္စာကိုလက်မခံဘူး Rohingya ဆိုတာလည်းမရှိဘူးရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာရှိတာဗာလဲဆိုတော့ခိုးဝင်ဘင်္ဂလီပဲเนาะခိုးဝင်ဘင်္ဂလီကိစ္စပဲရှိတယ်အဲ့တော့ဒီခိုးဝင်ဘင်္ဂလီနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ဒီကြိုက်တွယ်တဲ့ပုံမှာဒါရှုံချတယ်ဗာညာဆိုတာကတော့သူတို့တပ်မတော်ဘက်ကဖိအားပေးခဲ့တာလားအစီအစဉ်ဆွဲခဲ့တာလားဆိုတော့ဒါကတော့ဆောင်ရွက်တဲ့လူတွေပေါ်မှာပဲမူတည်မယ်ကျမတို့တော့ဒီလောက်တော့လန့်ပြီးမသိနိုင်ဘူးပေါ့နော်ဆောင်ရွက်တာတော့မရှိဘူးလို့ကျမအနေနဲ့ဒီနေ့ကနေမှပြောချင်တယ်ဒါကနိုင်ငံတော်လုံခြုံရေးနဲ့နိုင်ငံတကာနယ်စပ်ပြဿနာဖြစ်တယ်အဲ့တော့အဲ့ဒီပြဿနာတွေပေါ်မှာတကယ်တပ်မတော်ရဲ့ကင်တွယ်ဖြေရှင်းမှုအပိုင်းဟာတခြားနိုင်ငံတကာတွေမှာရှိတဲ့သူတို့ရဲ့နယ်စပ်ထက်ကျော်မှုတွေနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ကင်တွယ်ဖြေရှင်းမှုတွေနဲ့ကြည့်လို့ရှိရင်ဒီတပ်မတော်ရဲ့ဒီကင်တွယ်ဖြေရှင်းမှုကပျော့ပြောင်းနေသေးတယ်လို့ကျမတို့ဒါသုံးသပ်လို့ရတယ်နိုင်ငံရဲ့အချုပ်အခြာအာဏာနဲ့တောင်ပတ်သက်လာတဲ့အနေအထားဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့နော်
There's a sort of common conception that most Myanmar people, most Buddhist Myanmar people dislike Rohingya. And that's not necessarily untrue, but it would be difficult to say they could actually identify a Rohingya person because these folks have lived in such relative isolation to the rest of the country that most people wouldn't be able to, quote unquote, pick them out of a lineup. And as a result, it's difficult to know exactly who they dislike sometimes. One of the tragedies of this particular situation is that the fear and the hate and the disgust for these people is not based on any material interaction with them.
More than 800,000 Rohingyas are still living as refugees across the border in Bangladesh, with little hope of returning anytime soon. Thousands of them who remain in Myanmar are now confined in open-air detention facilities in central Rakhine State, where they're held arbitrarily and indefinitely.
အဓိကထိခိုက်ခံစားခဲ့ရတာတော့ရခိုင်လူမျိုးတွေနဲ့လက်ရှိပြည်တွင်းစစ်ပြဿနာရခိုင်မှာစစ်ဘေးဒုက္ခတွေနှစ်သိန်းကျော်နေပြီဖြစ်တယ်ကျွန်တော်ကိုယ်တိုင်လည်း ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်စစ်ပေးဆောင်ပြည်သူများကုန်ကြီးထောက်ပံ့ရေးကော်မတီရန်ကုန်မှာဥက္ကဋ္ဌအနေနဲ့တာဝန်ယူထားရတယ်အဖွဲ့အစည်းပေါင်းစုံနဲ့ကျွန်တော်ပူးပေါင်းဆောင်ရွက်ကြောင်းကျွန်တော်လက်ရှိအခြေအနေတွေကိုအသိဆုံးဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့နော်အခုထိပြည့်စုံလုံလောက်မှုအမိုးကာအောက်ကိုမိုးရာသီမှာတော့အမိုးကာအောက်ကိုလုံလောက်တဲ့အနေအထားမျိုးကျွန်တော်တို့မရှိဘူးနောက်တစ်ခါကိုဗစ်-19 ကိစ္စဝင်လာပြီခန့်ခွဲမှုတိကျတဲ့ရန်တရားတစ်ခုမရှိဘူးကျွန်တော်တို့အခုကုန်စည်စီးဆင်းမှုကိုလည်းအစိုးရပိတ်လိုက်တယ်ပြည်နယ်အစိုးရမှာလည်းတိကျတဲ့ဒီဟာနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့မူဝါဒမရှိဘူးထို့အတူပြည်ထောင်စုအစိုးရမှာလည်းဒီဟာနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ဘလို့စီမံခန့်ခွဲမယ်ဆိုတဲ့ရန်တရားတစ်ခုကျွန်တော်တို့အခုထိမရှိသေးဘူး
But Aung San Suu Kyi, once seen as a beacon for universal human rights, has been criticized by the international community for not speaking up for the persecuted Rohingya minority. The government even refers to Rohingya militants as terrorists and has refused to condemn the military for the brutal crackdown. A number of organizations have so far withdrawn the honors bestowed upon her, including a prestigious Human Rights Award from Amnesty International. Many others have moved to distance themselves or cut ties with the once celebrated figure. But Mo Tornau, a candidate for the Shan Nationalities League for Democracy, says the criticisms leveled at Ms. Suu Kyi is unfair. He feels that the international community needs to differentiate between her role as a human rights icon and her role as a politician and a nationalist.
And we were told by a lot of people that Aung San Suu Kyi is kind of like the savior for democracy and human rights, and that's how the Western media has been portraying her. But then, like she repeatedly said herself that, like she is a politician and she is a kind of like nationalist, like that she will only favor her, like her nation, like over these kind of values and principles. So of course, I think people are disappointed. But at the same time, we should not forget that what media portray her as icons of human rights and democracy might not necessarily be true. They forgot her standing as a politician. Like politicians, they make compromises and they make stands that are not popular.
And I don't think that's necessarily true for a couple of reasons. First, when Myanmar was brought to the International Court of Justice at The Hague, as many journalists pointed out and observers, she didn't have to go as the defender, but she chose to, and I don't think that was accidental. I think it was because she didn't want the military to paint her as soft on the Muslims or soft on the Rohingya, and so she went and made sure there was no light between her and the military. So she's really owned this issue, stood out in front of it, and endorsed essentially, whether tacitly or sometimes explicitly, by saying she didn't think the military did anything wrong.
Apart from her damaged reputation in the eyes of the international community, the country is also facing a sudden economic downturn. According to the World Bank, the country's GDP is expected to shrink from 6.8% to 0.5% this year, mainly due to the impact of the pandemic. Tek Kine is a former member of the ruling NLD party. She's recently set up a new party, the People's Pioneer Party, which is friendly with the military due to her growing disillusionment over Ms. Suu Kyi's policy priorities.
Majority of our people hope that once the NLD is in power, NLD will bring up the country, and NLD we will receive more foreign direct investments, we will have more robust economy with NLD party, but the hope doesn't come true.
And then we also have a legacy problems, means the past, like investment and infrastructure projects that are not necessarily really helping the local economy and the local people. So I think that is the reason that why there is a slow pace of, like reforms in NLD. And also many of the economic players and the high stakes are owned by military and also their affiliates. So if you consider all these, factors, then you know a reason of why the economic reform has been slow.
Still, in spite of all the criticisms leveled against her, Ms. Suu Kyi remains a popular figure locally among the majority Buddhist community. Around 70% of Myanmar's population, including Ms. Suu Kyi, belongs to the Burman Buddhist majority. Taxi driver Gu Ye, for example, is one of Ms. Suu Kyi's most ardent supporters. He feels that Ms. Suu Kyi is trying her best to govern the country under difficult circumstances.
အဲ့ဒါမျိုးကတော့လက်စုပ်လက်ကင်ပြစရာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တော့ဒီလမ်းတွေဘာတွေလောက်ပါပဲကျန်တဲ့ဟာတွေကလည်းသူလည်းတိတ်ပြီးတော့အောင်မြင်အောင်စူးစမ်းသေးပဲသူနောက်တက်တန်းတစ်ခုမှထပ်ပြီးတော့သူ့ကိုအုပ်ချုပ်ပြီးပေးနိုင်မှာသူလည်းလောက်တာတွေအကောင့်တက်ပုံမှာပေါ့နော်ရုပ်တရက်ကြီးကတော့ပြောလို့မရဘူးပေါ့နော်အခုဆိုရင်သူလောက်သမျှတွေအကုန်လုံးကတော့အောင်မြင်တယ်လို့တော့ပြောလို့မရဘူးပေါ့နော်အကုန်လုံးတော့အဆင်ပြေအောင်လိုက်လုပ်ပေးတယ်
The ruling party can help the people get out of poverty within 5 years. That we never expected that. It would never happen. It would not happen within 5 years. The only thing that we expect from the current ruling party is the moral leadership and the morality that the government leaders exhibit to our people. So we are so sad to see that the political prisoner numbers, man by man, is nearly 600 right now. They were being charged, they were being jailed, they were locked up in the prisons, and they were charged for many different articles just because they expressed themselves. That's because they expressed something against with the current ruling party. So also based on the data, facts and data, that the current government also, they belong to the highest percentage of the perpetration of the freedom of expression at the same time, right? And then military follow the government. So this is sad to see that the current government is not well informed about the real values and principle of the freedom of expression and how to respect the media and how to embrace this human rights defender in the country. So I think the freedom of expression reform is not there. It's been going backward.
But will voters give her and NLD another chance at the polls? Will she be able to loosen the century-old military's grip on the country and live up to her reputation as a moral and human rights icon? November 8, 2015 was a historic moment for the people in Myanmar. That was when the National League for Democracy, or NLD, won the country's first free and open election. The party won 77% of the seats in the landmark polls. Myanmar's then ruling party, Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, conceded defeat and handed over power to the leader of NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi. It was a defining moment for the people as the country embarked on an unsteady and rocky journey towards democracy from a military dictatorship.
It was significant for several factors, but two stand out. One is because the USDP and the military accepted the results of the election and did a peaceful transition of power. Now, I think back in 2015, this was something that was a niggling doubt at the backs of people's minds, that because of the broken promises in 1990, there was some concern that would either the USDP or the military somehow try to come up and say, hang on, there are a few more steps before we can transfer power. But that didn't happen. And of course, the other significant factor was that the votes for the NLD actually indicated the interest and the desire of many people in the country, across communities and so on, that they wanted change, they wanted to move on. And the direction was to go on from that point forward rather than look back.
It was an entirely different story back in 1990. On May 27, 1990, the opposition NLD secured 80% of the parliamentary seats, or 392 out of 485 seats in a surprisingly free and fair election. But the military government led by General Tan Shui refused to recognize the result of the elections. Instead, the military government arrested and imprisoned dozens of opposition parliamentarians following an army crackdown.
The military junta of the day was supposedly honoring its promise to convene multi-party elections 2 years after it had taken power in September 1988. So the promise was they would settle whatever quote-unquote law and order issues that were in the country and the situation at the time when the military coup happened in 1988. And then after convening these multi-party elections, power would be transferred to the political party who won the elections, enabling it to form a government. So it was on that basis that the whole country was anticipating the outcome of the 1990 elections. I think a huge disappointment to many people in the country and of course around the world who were watching Myanmar and of course who were hoping for change to happen.
So when NLD won the 2015 election, there was growing concern that the military-backed USDP would do the same thing in not recognizing the outcome of the election. That's also how Kum Mya-yi felt back then. He's among those who celebrated the party's victory in bringing an end to the military rule. He's now part of Myanmar's Federal Democratic Force, a political party made up of former members of the NLD.
ကျွန်တော်အရန်ဝမ်းသာတာပေါ့ဝမ်းသာတယ်ဆိုတာဗျာပုံမှန်လင်းလင်းပြောရလို့ရှိရင်အနိုင်ရကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တွေ့ကြုံရအနိုင်ရသွားတဲ့အချိန်မှာဝမ်းသာပြီးမဲ့လေကျွန်တော်တို့ရေရေတင်းတင်းကြီးတော့ဟိုလွတ်လွတ်လပ်လပ်ကြီးမဝမ်းသာနိုင်ဘူးပေါ့ဗျာဘာဖြစ်လို့လဲဆိုတဲ့အခါကျတော့အာဏာတွေပိုင်းမလွှဲခဲ့ရင်ဆိုတဲ့စိုးရိမ်မှုရရှိနေတယ် ဒါကလည်း1990တော့ကြုံခဲ့ဘူးတဲ့အတွေ့အကြုံတွေရပါဘူးသို့တော်လည်းပဲဟိုသမ္မတဦးသိန်းစိန်ဆိုရကလည်း GGP နဲ့အကုန်အာဏာတွေလွှဲပေးခဲ့တဲ့အခါမှာကျွန်တော်တို့85ရာခိုင်နှုန်းပေါ့ဗျာဘယ်လိုပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်2008ဖွဲ့စည်းပုံအခြေခံဥပဒေအောက်ကကျင်းပတဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲတွေပါဒါပေမဲ့လည်း85ရာခိုင်နှုန်းကျွန်တော်တို့အရသာကျွန်တော်တို့လူချင်းနဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့မဲပေးပြီးရွေးချယ်တင်မြှောက်တဲ့အစိုးရတရက်ဗမာပြည်မှာပထမအဆုံးစပြီးတော့ပေါ်လာတာနှစ်ပေါင်း90ကျော်ကြာတဲ့အချိန်မှာပေါ်လာတာဒီ
2015ရွေးကောက်ပွဲပုံမှာတော့ဒီဟာဗာအားလုံးကနေမှလူထုညှော်လင်းချက်ပေါ့နော်လူထုကညှော်လင်းချက်2015အစိုးရထက်ကိုပို့ပြီးတော့လှုပ်လာနိုင်လိမ့်မယ်ဆိုတဲ့ညှော်လင်းတဲ့အစိုးရတက်ကိုလူထုကတခဲနဲ့တာဝန်ပေးလိုက်တယ်ဆိုတော့ဒါသူ့ရဲ့ဒီမိုကရေစီအောင်ပွဲဆိုပြီးတော့ပြောလို့တော့ရတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဆိုပေမဲ့ဟိုဒါပေမဲ့တကယ်ဒီဒီမိုကရေစီလမ်းကြောင်းကိုဘယ်သူကအခြေချခဲ့တာလဲဆိုတဲ့ဥစ္စာလဲဒါကျမတို့ကပြန်ပြီးတော့ဒါတစ်ချက်လဲစဉ်းစားဖို့လိုတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အခါကျတော့အဲ့တော့ဒီမိုကရေစီကိုဆက်ပြီးတော့ဟိုသွားတယ်ဆိုတဲ့နေရာမှာတော့ဒါစနစ်တကျအကောင့်ထဲပေါ်ဆောင်ရွက်ဖို့လိုတာပေါ့ဒါတပိုင်းပြည်ခိုင်ဖြိုးပါတီအနေနဲ့ဒီမိုကရေစီအတူကူးပြောင်းရေးဖြစ်စဉ်မှာရှိနေမှာလားမရှိနေဘူးလားဆိုတော့ပြည်ခိုင်ဖြိုးပါတီကခုနပြောတဲ့ဒီမိုကရေစီအသွင်ကူးပြောင်းရေးဆိုတဲ့ဟာကိုစနစ်တကျတကယ်ကိုအကောင့်ထဲပေါ်ဆောင်ရွက်နိုင်ခဲ့တဲ့လူဖြစ်တယ်ဆောင်ရွက်ဖို့လဲကျမတို့မှာဆောင်ရွက်ဖို့လုပ်ငန်းစဉ်တွေလည်းအစီအမံချထားပြီးသားလည်းရှိတယ်
But the military remains an influential part of the country's political establishment. Under Myanmar's 2008 constitution, 25% of parliamentary seats are reserved for military appointees, giving them an effective veto power. 3 major portfolios, defense, home affairs, and border affairs are also reserved for the military.
That was one way, I think, that they wanted to exert that overall security role. So if you look at it that way, those conditions really highlight the Myanmar military's concern over their role as the defender or the provider of security, of national security, if you will, harking back to all those historical precedents. And I think this is something that it's discussed and somehow ingrained in the different intakes of military officers, and they do see this as some kind of a historical role and duty.
So far, the government has failed in its efforts to reduce the role and influence of the military in the government. In March this year, the NLD had proposed an amendment to reduce the military's percentage of parliamentary seats over time, from 25% today down to 15% after the 2020 election, 10% after 2025, and 5% after 2030. But the move was thwarted by the military.
It has to do with the overall perception, mindset, and attitudes in the Myanmar Armed Forces of what is their role and mandate, and how seriously they take it. And of course, it also harks back to maybe concerns. They may be unfounded, but nevertheless they are concerns that some kind of witch hunt or trial might take place for past atrocities or the previous generations of what the military junta had done in terms of repressing the democracy movement. Or maybe the military feels that somehow, again, in a binary situation, a black and white picture is painted, and they're somehow always seen as the bad guy. So I think it's a combination of all those perceptions and attitudes that maybe fuel the concern up to now that limiting the military's role would mean limiting many other things, including, of course, some of the economic enterprises and so on that were established by the military during the days of the military government for some kind of income generation for past and present military officers.
At present, the NLD holds about 80% of the available seats in the upper and lower houses. The military-backed USDP about 10%, the Arakan National Party about 4%, and the Shan Nationalities League for Democracy SNLD about 3%. But it's been the desire on the part of the USDP to win back power from the NLD.
ဒီခိုင်မျိုးပါတီအနေနဲ့ဒီ2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာအကောင်းဆုံးအများဆုံးအနိုင်ရအောင်ပြင်လဲပြင်ဆင်ထားတယ်ကိုကိုလည်းယုံကြည်မှုတွေလည်းရှိကြတယ်ဒီခိုင်မျိုးပါတီအနေနဲ့လည်းဒါအဆဆရရပြင်ဆင်ထားတယ်ပေါ့နော်ပြင်ဆင်ထားပါတယ်ငါရွေးကောက်ပွဲရှုံးပြီးတဲ့နောက်ပိုင်းမှာတော့ USDP ရဲ့ပါတီရဲ့ပေါ့လေပါတီရဲ့ပုံရင်းကကျသွားတာတော့ဒါဟိုအားလုံးဟိုအမြင်ပဲပေါ့လေအဲဆိုတော့ဒါမှမဟုတ်ဟိုဩဇာကတော့ရှိနေတာပေါ့ဘာကြောင့်ဩဇာရှိနေလဲဆိုတော့USDP ရဲ့စပြီးတော့ဖွဲ့စည်းလာကြတဲ့ကဒါကျွန်တော်တို့ဟိုတက်မတော်ကနေပြီးတော့တက်မတော်ဆိုကလက်ထက်မှာပဲအသင်းကနေပြီးမှကျွန်တော်တို့ပါတီကိုပြောင်းခဲ့တာဆိုတော့ဟိုတက်မတော်နဲ့သူနဲ့ကဟိုကျွန်တော်တို့တတိတခြားစီလို့ပြောပြမယ်လို့လဲဟိုစပြီးတီထောင်လာကွာတက်မတော်ကတီထောင်လာတာဆိုတော့ဟိုဒါကခွဲမမြင်ဘူးပေါ့လေအဲကြခွဲမမြင်ဘူးဒီဗိုလ်ချုပ်ကြီးတွေဗိုလ်ချုပ်ဟောင်းတွေကပဲဒီကျွန်တော်တို့ဟိုကိုပါတီကိုဥဆောင်ခဲ့တာဆိုတော့ဟိုအတိုင်းဩဇာကတော့ရှိနေတာပေါ့ဒါမှမဟုတ်2015ရွေးကောက်ပွဲအပြီးမှာအဲ့ဩဇာက2010ရွေးကောက်ပွဲအပြီးမှလို့မျိုးတော့အင်အားကောင်းနေရလို့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့မျိုးစားဘူးပေါ့လေအဲ့ကြတော့
Gu Ye, who is a strong supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party, understands that it is not an easy task to remove the military's influence in the government.
တက်ခဲ့ခန်းကနာလည်းအများကြီးပေါ့စတက်နဲ့သူနဲ့ကလည်းဖယ်ပြစ်လို့မရဘူးပေါ့နော်စတက်ဆိုတော့လည်းဟိုသူ့ရဲ့ဟိုအင်္ဂါစီထဲမှာပါနေတော့သူ့ကိုလည်းလုံးလျားကြီးဖယ်ပြစ်လို့မရဘူးအဲ့ဒီမှာတော့တော်တော်ကြီးကိုနောက်9နှစ်လဲအဲ့ဒါကိုတော်တော်ရှင်းအောင်ပဲထင်ပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်လည်းတိတ်ပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒါကြီးကတော်တော်ကြီးရောရှုပ်ထွေးပါတယ်အဲ့ကိစ္စကြီးကလေဒါလွတ်တော်တဲ့ကနီးနေပဲဖြည့်ရှင်းတာပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီဟာကိုပြည်သူတွေလိုချင်တဲ့ဟာကိုသိပါတယ်အကုန်လုံးကလည်းမျောလင့်တယ်ဆိုပေမဲ့လည်းတော်တော်ကြီးကိုဒါခက်ခဲကြီးရှင်းရမှာကြီးပေါ့နော် တိတ်တော့လွယ်လွယ်ကူနဲ့တော့ဖြစ်မှာတော့မဟုတ်ဘူးเนาะပေါင်းတယ်ပေါ်တော့အဲ့ဒါကြီးရှိတချို့တွေကအားမရဘူးပေါ့เนาะအဲ့ဒါအပေါ်မှာ
ဒီရွေးကောက်ပွဲအမျိုးသားဒီမိုကရေစီအဖွဲ့ချုပ်ရဲ့ပေါ့လေဟိုကျွန်တော်တို့ဟိုအဓိကဂတိပြည်သူကိုဂတိကိုပေါ့လေရွေးကောက်ပွဲကြီးညာစာတမ်းမှာအဓိကသူကခြေခံဥပဒေပြင်ဆင်မယ်ပေါ့သူတို့နောက်ကပြည်တွင်းငြိမ်းချမ်းရအောင်ဟိုပါပေါ့သူလုံးမယ်ဆိုတော့ဟိုဒီဂတိပြုချက်တွေပါခဲ့တယ်ပါခဲ့တော့အဲ့ကြတော့အခြေခံဥပဒေပြင်ဆင်တဲ့တပြိုင်နက်တည်းမှာပဲအခြေခံဥပဒေမှာကအဓိကတက်မတော်ကိုဟိုပါပေါ့အာဏာတော်တော်များများပေးအပ်ထားတာမျိုးတွေရှိတယ်ဆိုတော့အခြေခံဥပဒေပြင်ဆင်မယ်ဆိုတာကတက်မတော်ရဲ့အာဏာကိုဟိုဖယ်ရှားမယ်ဆိုတဲ့အဓိပ္ပာယ်တက်ရောက်မှုမျိုးတော့ရှိတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လို့အိုက်ကာလာကလေးကကျွန်တော်တို့မျိုးသားဒီမိုကရေစီအဖွဲ့ချုပ်ကတက်မတော်ရဲ့ပါဝင်မှုကိုဖယ်ရှားပစ်မယ်ဆိုတဲ့နိုင်ငံရေးတွေးခေါ်မျိုးမရှိခဲ့ဘူးလို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ထင်တယ်။ဘာကြောင့်လဲသူတို့အဲ့လိုမျိုးပုံမှန်လေးပြောခဲ့တာမရှိဘူး။ချိန်ခံဥပဒေပြင်ဆင်မယ်လို့တော့တော်ရတော်နေရဖြစ်တော့တကယ်ပဲပြင်ရမယ်အခြေဟိုပါပေါ့ဥပဒေဖြစ်နေတာပေါ့။အဲ့ကြတော့သူတို့ဟိုဒီအခြေအနေမှာပြီးခဲ့တဲ့9နှစ်ကိုဟိုကျွန်တော်တို့ပြန်ကြည့်မယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မျိုးသားဒီမိုကရေစီအဖွဲ့ချုပ်ကဦးဆောင်ပြီးတော့လွှတ်တော်ထဲမှာချိန်ခံဥပဒေပြင်ဆင်ဖို့ကြိုးစားတယ်။တော်တော်လေးအခွင့်အရေးနေတဲ့အခြေအနေမျိုးမှာရှိပါတယ်။
Observers believe that any promise to amend the constitution to reduce the military's influence in politics would be futile. Any real changes to the constitution would have to be backed by the military itself.
Everybody is aware that we need the participation of the military member in the parliament to eventually amend the constitution as per democratic principle and value. So I think it is so challenging for the current government or for the upcoming government as well to eventually amend the constitution, because this constitution is designed not to be amended like that without the compromise and without the agreement of the military. So I feel like the constitution amendment in the through the parliament process is almost impossible.
A damaged international reputation due to the ill treatment of the Rohingya community, a slowing economy, and the failure to amend the constitution to reduce the army's role in politics. Will Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party be able to repeat its stunning victory in the light of her unfulfilled promises? With just 2 weeks to go before voters in Myanmar cast their ballot to choose their next government, it remains unclear what the outcome of the election will be. What is certain, the democratic momentum which catapulted the NLD to power 5 years ago has fast evaporated. There's currently a widespread perception that Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party have not delivered on their promises. And a spike in COVID-19 cases and the subsequent lockdown in key townships just 2 months prior to election have dampened voter sentiments. The nationwide COVID-19 tally has more than doubled to over 30,000 infections and 800 deaths. On September 6, 2020, the country reported 100 new cases, the biggest daily increase since the first confirmed infection in March.
COVID is not just in Myanmar but around the world, but in Myanmar it's even worse because of the health system situations. We don't feel like we would be able to cope with this, the consequences of the COVID-19. So it's so worrying for us that election is going to happen amid the pandemic. So we are really worried about the result at the same time. Like even though people would like to go out and vote, would they be feeling safe for them for the health reason to go out and vote in person? And if government decided to keep going with this election planned, if they don't have enough preparation for that, then it's gonna impact on the election result. There will be a lot of dispute after the election.
Some, like 28-year-old Tet Ong Lin, has decided not to vote in this election. The social worker, who works for a relief agency that delivers humanitarian aid to the residents in conflict areas in Myanmar, feels that nothing much has changed since the NLD came to power 5 years ago.
မဲမဲပေးဖို့ဘာလို့ဆုံးဖြတ်ထားရလဲဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်ကဒီဘောနော်ဒီ2015မှာတုန်းက NLD အစိုးရနိုင်ရရှိခဲ့တယ်တောင်ပြိုကမ်းပြိုနိုင်ရရှိခဲ့တယ်အဲ့ဒီဟာကျွန်တော်တို့အားပေးထောက်ခံခဲ့2015အထိကတော့ဟိုနောက်ပိုင်းမှာတော့ဟိုမထောက်ခံတော့ဘူးဆိုတာတော့မဟုတ်ဘူးကျွန်တော်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲကိုယုံကြည်မရှိတော့ဘာကြောင့်ရွေးကောက်ပွဲကိုယုံကြည်မရှိတာလဲဆိုရင်လွှတ်တော်ထဲမှာမဲမဲပေးပဲဝင်ထိုင်နေတဲ့25%တော့စစ်တပ်ကလူတွေရှိနေတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့မဲပေးလေဒီလူတွေကိုတိုက်နိုင်မှာလားလို့မေး constitution ပြင်ဖို့အတွက်ပြင်ပြီးတော့လုပ်ဖို့အတွက်ကိုအဆင်မပြေနိုင်သေးဘူးအဓိကအပြင်ကပြည်သူတွေရွေးကောက်ထားတဲ့ကိုယ်စားလှယ်တွေနဲ့ပြည်သူတွေရွေးကောက်တင်မြှောက်ထားခြင်းမရှိတဲ့ကိုယ်စားလှယ်တွေနဲ့တဒန်းတည်းမထားနိုင်တဲ့အတွက်မဲမဲပေးခြင်းဖြစ်တယ်ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့
In fact, two influential groups, the All Burma Federation of Student Unions and the All Burma Federation of Trade Unions have called for a boycott of the election. Both groups argue that until the military drafted constitution is amended, any election will be pointless.
ပါဝင်ပတ်သက်နေတဲ့အရာတွေကိုတိုက်ထုတ်နိုင်မယ်လို့မျှော်လင့်ချက်တွေနဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကထည့်ခဲ့တယ်လူတို့ကတော့စားနပ်ရိက္ခာတော့အကုန်လုံးပဲလူတိုင်းလူကတော့စားနပ်ရိက္ခာနဲ့တချမ်းချမ်းသာသာအေးချမ်းချမ်းနေခြင်းတဲ့လူတွေကြီးပဲသို့တော့ဟိုငါတို့က NLD ကိုမဲပေးတယ်ဆိုတာနိုင်ငံရေးမူဘောင်တွေကိုလုတ်ကင်နိုင်ပြီးတော့တွန်းလှန်နိုင်မယ်လို့မျှော်လင့်လို့မဲပေးခဲ့ကြတာဒါပေမဲ့စစ်တပ်က25%နဲ့ပြည်သူတွေကိုစော်ကားခြင်းကိုလွှတ်တော်ထဲမှာခံနေရတယ်အဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကိုကျွန်တော်တို့အနေနဲ့ကမဲမပေးရင်လည်းဘာဖြစ်မလဲဆိုဘာမှထူလာမှာမဟုတ်ဘူးဟောစစ်တပ်ရှိနေတယ်လွှတ်တော်ထဲမှာဆိုတော့စစ်တပ်ရဲ့နိုင်ငံရေးပူပေါင်းတွေကိုဒီ9နှစ်20ကနေ25အတွင်းမှာ NLD ကရဲမုံတိုက်ခိုက်ပြင်ဆင်နိုင်မယ်ဆိုရင်လူတို့ရဲ့ရွေးကောက်ပွဲပေါ်စိတ်ဝင်စားမှုကပိုပြီးမြင့်တက်လာနိုင်လိမ့်မယ်
The reason why we voted NLD is because we don't like the militarization in our daily life, in every layer, in every sector, as well as we don't like the supremacist mindset that the majority always is right. The majority always will rule over the minority, and there is also impunity is being in place in Myanmar for a long time. So I think that's why people were thirsty of the democratic value and they voted NLD for it, not just because of Islamophobia, but what happened is like in 2015. The NLD government, they were so worried and they excluded all the Muslim candidates from running the election. So these Muslim party members, they were so loyal to the party, but they were excluded. But when I interviewed them, like how they feel, because they've been supporting NLD, but in the end they were excluded just because they are Muslim.
Still, despite Ms. Suu Kyi's lackluster records on several fronts, she's still loved at home and is expected to be returned to power after November 8th.
Her popularity is not just based on, I think, that charisma that people who have been in direct contact or interaction with her have experienced. It also has to do with Aung San Suu Kyi having been the face of resistance all through those years under military rule.
ဒေါ်ဆန်းစုကြည်ကြောင့်ဘာတွေစဉ်းစားလဲဆိုတော့ဒေါ်ဆန်းစုကြည်ကဗိုလ်ချုပ်အောင်ဆန်းရဲ့သမီးလေနောက်ပြီးတော့ဗိုလ်ချုပ်အောင်ဆန်းရဲ့သမီးတွေမဟုတ်ပါဘူးဗိုလ်ချုပ်အောင်ဆန်းသွေးတွေလည်းပါတယ်ဗိုလ်ချုပ်အောင်ဆန်းလိုမျိုးစိတ်ဓာတ်တွေလည်းအများကြီးရှိတယ်ပညာလည်းပညာတတ်တယ်ဟိုတကယ်တမ်းလည်းဟိုနိုင်ငံတကာမှာကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်သူ့ရဲ့ပုံရိပ်ကြီးကတော်တော်ရုပ်ကြီးပါတယ်
But even if Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party were to win again in this election, observers expect the status quo will remain.
တကယ်လို့မြို့သားမျိုးကိုဖွဲ့ချုပ်က2020ရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာဆက်နိုင်မယ်အဲ့ဒါဆိုရင်သူတို့10နှစ်တာပေါ့လေပြီးခဲ့တဲ့9နှစ်ရယ်နောက်9နှစ်ရယ်10နှစ်တာကျွန်တော်တို့နိုင်ငံကိုပေါ့ဥဆောင်ဝင်ရတာပေါ့လေအဲ့ဒါဆိုတော့အပြည့်အဝကြီးကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီတက်မတော်ကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကနေပြီးတော့မရှိတော့ဘူးဆိုတဲ့အနေအထားမျိုးတော့စွမ်းဆောင်နိုင်နိုင်မယ်လို့ကျွန်တော်မယူဆဘူးသူဆက်ရှိနေတယ်ဥမာတက်မတော်ကအတိုင်းအတာတစ်ခုကျွန်တော်ဒါမှမဟုတ် short ချနိုင်ပါမလားဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တန်တရားပေါ့လေကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့ဒီယူဆချက်ကတော့ရှိနေအောင်ပဲ
They have to rule the country according to 2008 constitution. Because of 2008 constitution, the military regime cannot come in. So long as the military and all the stakeholders and all the people of Myanmar are accepting 2008 constitutions, military dictatorship will not come in again. That is why whatever the government is elected by the people, and they will have to rule the country by 2008 constitution, I don't think the military dictatorship can come in again.
First-time voter, 18-year-old Gal Kenjo, for one, is also grateful that Aung San Suu Kyi's struggle for democracy has paid dividends somewhat. He's optimistic that their democratic right would not be so easily snatched away from the people of Myanmar so long as she's around.
ပေးချင်တိုင်းပေးပြန်ယူချင်တိုင်းယူလို့ရတဲ့အရာမှမဟုတ်တာเนาะပြီးတော့ကျန်းခိုင်ရင်နိုင်မယ်လို့လည်းတိတ်ပြီးတော့မမျှော်လင့်ထားအောင်ခင်ဗျာဘာလို့လဲဆိုတော့အခုဆိုရင်ပဲကြည်ပါတိုင်းပြည်လုံးပေါ့နော်8ရက်8လမှာပေါ့နော်အနီတွေလွှမ်းသွားတယ်ဆိုတာလည်းအကုန်လုံးပဲမျက်မြင်ကိုယ်တွေ့ဖြစ်ပါလိမ့်မယ်ဘယ်သူနိုင်တယ်ဘယ်သူရှုံးတယ်ဆိုတာလည်းပေါ့နော်အခုပေါ်ပြည်သူတွေကိုယ်တိုင်ကပေါ့နော်တိလောက်ပြီးလဲထင်ပါတယ်ပေါ့နော်နိုင်တယ်မနိုင်ဘူးဆိုတာတော့ပေါ့နော်ဘယ်လိုဖြစ်လာမယ်ဆိုတော့မသိသေးဘူးခင်ဗျာချွတ်ချော်ပြီးတော့နိုင်ခဲ့လို့ရှိရင်လည်းပေါ့နော်ဒီမိုကရေစီစနစ်ကဖျက်သိမ်းလို့ရမယ်လို့လည်းမထင်ပါဘူးခင်ဗျာ
I don't think a rollback is possible. So I think when the USDP government started instituting those wide-ranging reforms back in 2011, 2012, I had commented that there's no turning back. And what I meant was, once you've started on this path, you can't say, oops, I'm sorry, I'm kind of like, you know, calling a timeout. That's not possible. That's not possible for any political party or entity in Myanmar today.
Her government has been charged with genocide by the UN International Court of Justice. Ms. Suu Kyi even cuts a lonely figure, shunned and isolated by the Western allies for endorsing the military's alleged persecution and atrocities against the Rohingya community. Still, most observers expect that the NLD and its talismanic leader will be returned to power come November 8th. In spite of her shortcomings, she remains hugely popular at home, especially among the majority ethnic Burmese, who make up about 2/3 of the country's population. One can only hope that she will live up to her reputation as a true champion of the people across all nationalities and rediscover her moral voice once more.